Hi, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Mark Graven. We're joined today by Woody Zuill. Woody, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for calling me in. This is fantastic.
Well, I'm happy we could do the podcast, and I think we're going to be able to explore some different topics than we normally cover here, but it'll also be interesting, I think, to make connections between the work that you've done and the way that you've done it and taught, comparing that where we can to broader lean principles. But for context, for the audience, I first met Woody. I saw him speak at a conference in Minneapolis that was organized by our mutual friends Joel Tosi and Dion Stewart, good friends of mine and of the podcast. And Woody, I really enjoyed your talk. And then we've been able to be part of a sort of a lean consultant. I don't know if you want that label or not. I don't know if I want that label, but a consultants networking group here in the pandemic. And you've been really helpful to people and had a lot of insights. So that's setting the bar high for you here, but welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed this and meeting with the group that you just mentioned. And I'd first heard of you, I'm sure, from something that was on Twitter. And I read some blog posts you had written. And I could see the parallels between the world that you're active in and the world I'm active in. And I really appreciate seeing it from different points of view. The same basic concepts in some way or another apply in so many places. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of useful to see it, how it's, viewed from a different perspective.
Yeah. So I always like to let guests introduce themselves. If you want to, I'm interested, for example, how did you get into computer programming? If you can kind of give a little context for your career and the work that you've done.
Sure. So I started out using computers in the very early 80s because I was in an industry at the time. I owned a couple little businesses where we could tell that computers were going to become important. So I thought I should get some. We got a couple computers, started using them, found that the computers worked okay, but the software was terrible. And after seeking software that would do the jobs we needed to have done, it became clear to me that maybe I'll need to learn to program computers myself. I didn't understand that there would be any limitations to that. So I just started, just writing some software. It turned out that I could write a little bit every day that would increase the usability for my user base, which was just people who worked for me, and deliver it on a daily basis. So this grew many years later for me into a focus of how I like to work. If you can start something and get it into the hands of the users and they find it useful, and you just keep adding to it over time, it's a much better way to work than trying to figure out everything you want your software to do and writing it all and then delivering it. And that actually is turned out to be what a lot of companies do nowadays. And there's some big advantages to it. Matter of fact, I would say if we could run the rest of our lives the way we can do software, we probably would want to, where we could just say, hey, well, I'd like a refrigerator, but I don't need all the features. And then you could add the features as you go and take away features you didn't like. But you can't do that with a refrigerator really very well. So yeah, software turned out to be an interesting thing to me. And I ended up making it my career. It took about 15 years to go from writing software for my own use to writing software for other people's use.
So I wonder, it sounds like you fell into, it was intuitive to you to do the work the way you did it. You weren't taught that. I don't know if this was prevailing at the time. I know later it became prevailing and said, well, Woody, before you write any code, you need to write a requirements document.
Right.
Have all sorts of plans and release schedules and Gantt charts. You weren't doing that. And what you're doing, what you're describing sounds like Agile. I don't know what you think about that term.
Yeah, so I think that's when Agile came along, I recognized it instantly as very related to the way I naturally had started working. But I will say this, most business people, almost every business person I've ever worked with in some way or another, they started out with a smaller business and they grew it to a bigger business. They started out with a few ideas and then they steered to what they really thought they should do over time. That's sort of a natural way of approaching things. and software is definitely one of those things. So I don't think this is unique to software. It's not an unusual way to approach stuff. I know when I was young in the church that I went to as a little kid, they would work on this summer camp. They would go up and build a kitchen, or they would build a cabin or whatever. And they would go up there with enough materials to do the minimal thing they thought they wanted to get done. And then the next time they'd go up, they'd bring some more stuff. But that original thing would be useful from that day forward. So just a lot of people work this way. It wasn't something I invented. I think it had been impressed on me as a younger person working for other people. It wasn't until I was about 30 years old that I started learning to program. And I had no fear at the time that I couldn't, that it would be a problem for me, but it turned out to be an extremely complex thing. It was good. I started with just little bits. It would have been overwhelming otherwise.
Yeah, and what I heard you describing there, I mean, it sounds like you're talking about iteration,
exactly,
small batches, and flow.
Yeah. Yes.
And so or if you could talk about some of your earlier introduction to flow. You were telling me before we started recording your experiences in a manufacturing company and with flow and pull systems.
So I worked for a firm in the late 70s where the guy had invented a part for some. I won't go into details. I don't know what I might have signed 40 years ago or whatever. But he had invented a thing that was part of a thing that was typically manufactured, more or less custom manufactured usually. And with his new invention, he was able to get a much higher quality product every time. So I wanted an opportunity to work for them, and I had this chance, and I went down there, and it turned out the way they did their work is somebody would order one of these products, and they would bring it through their factory as fast as they could. So my particular job was at one point in the manufacturing process, and you didn't get hired as a job. You bought your spot in the manufacturing process. So in other words, he didn't have any employees. He basically had people that were leasing some space, and they just needed to fulfill their little needs. So an order would come in. I would get a card, and the card would say, we need 3 of these or 2 of these, and this needs to have this particular way it's made, or that one has to have this part of it. And I would just make them. Well, that is sort of a pull system, and it was very much we might sometimes call it Kanban system.
Yeah.
And I was surprised to watch this. I didn't know what it was. I didn't have any words for it. It took me another 5 or 6 years before I realized maybe I should learn these processes. There was nothing to read. And so I just did my own lame versions of using this in my own manufacturing little company that I started shortly after that. And in the long run, people started writing about this in the early 90s, I guess. And I'm going, oh, yeah, I know what that is. And so to me, I just embedded those same ideas in the way I wrote software.
And what you're describing in that factory sounds like a combination of like a really old piecework system. It also sounds like it was early gig economy.
Yeah, in a way, that's true. But I think this fellow understood this required highly skilled craftspeople. And so you can't just hire someone off the street and teach them how to do some of the processes they needed to do. And so it was a bigger thing than just merely, if you were going to make a company just doing, injection molding and so on, and then you take the pieces and you assemble them, all of that this was much higher craft than that. So I think it fit the need. And maybe much of what we do nowadays, when we think about lean, has brought us back to this concept that we need highly experienced people if we're going to get the flow we want. So that we probably should be talking about flow.
Yeah.
So I have a definition I use for flow for programming, and it kind of comes off of the basic introductory description of flow for manufacturing. So I say for software development, flow would be the start to completion of some deliverable part of the software people are using from beginning to end with as little waste of queuing and waste of inventory as we can have. So if we can eliminate the waste of queuing and the waste of inventory, that means we won't have interruptions, we won't have context switching and multitasking and all these things. If we can find a way to accomplish that, then we will get a much bigger benefit than if we figured out how to break everything apart into little bits and did it in a more typical software development manner, where we figure out all the requirements up front, and then we maybe estimate all of those things, and then maybe we refine it a bit, and then finally we start building it. We end up in projects. When I was younger, I would see projects at companies that would take a year or two. And this is trying to get this approach, kind of the Agile approach or the more current approach, trying to get something into use by people within a few days or weeks of the inception of the project. And then you build on it. This gives us one super advantage of rapid feedback from actual users, which is hard to get in the older model. Now, you can't do that with all kinds of manufacturing, but you can do that with software development. And I think that's a powerful thing.
And so you seem to discover some, these flow principles in a way that was intuitive to you, or you convinced yourself of the benefits. How often are you placed in a position where you're trying to help convince an organization that better flow is possible, where people are maybe stuck in older methods, or are you generally brought in once people have already convinced themselves of some of those basic fundamentals?
Yeah, so what normally is happening for me right now, and this was, I got to be really clear, I didn't set out to try to do something that people would want to bring me in as a consultant to do. Mm-hmm. I accidentally fell into this. What had happened was I was hired to work with a team that was not very successful, and they wanted a new manager for this team. And I in the interview process, I went to the person who would become my boss, and he was interviewing me. And I told him that these people are not doing well, not because they are incapable or incompetent or they're not good at doing their work. They're not doing well because they're being poorly managed. Mm. That means you are doing a bad job. And so nobody wants to hear that when you're out to hire somebody. Yeah. But that's sort of the way that I feel. I believe that the people doing the work, at least in software development, they don't need to be more closely controlled. They need to be liberated. If you liberate the people who are already pretty smart folks to be free to do the best they can do, you'll get some great benefits that you can't do by trying to control that output. The output from a team is not a matter of adding together the bits of work that people are doing. In the Agile world, the results are going to come from making it easy for people to interact and work well together. Yeah. And this means we have to learn what does it really mean to do the work that we're doing. And so, what we ended up with after about 6 months of attempting to, I hope I haven't gone off topic for you here.
No, go ahead.
So they had hired me to come in, and I basically told them they don't need a manager. They need somebody to protect them from the managers. So I said, if you're willing to hire me to protect them from the managers, then I'm willing to come in. I actually told them there has to be a year of no interference. If whatever you see us doing, it doesn't make you happy, you just need to, swallow it. Don't bring that to the surface. If you, I need to have the right to either cancel or at least postpone any work that the team's doing. If they're not doing well with it, and there's at least 2 projects that were about a year behind when they hired me. If the team's not doing well with it, maybe they shouldn't be doing it. Let's get the skills we need, build those skills to be able to do this work, rather than just trying to do it, and so on. There were 5 or 6 limitations I put on them. I said, if you want to try this, this is what you're going to need to do. Now, I firmly believe in almost any type of work that the people doing the work are usually the best ones to understand how to manage it. Right. We just don't give them the freedom to be able to do that. And I'd spent about 10 years, going from 1999 to 2009, going through some pretty awful situations, trying to learn how to influence change when you don't have the power to to force that change.
Right.
And I think that's actually a better way to go about doing things.
Right.
And the end result for this was just that this team had about 6 months of us as a team figuring out how are we going to make the improvements we need to have. And then like a one day amazing event that caused us to completely change the way we were working. So we have been studying together. That's one thing that's important for a team of this sort, is to spend time studying together, because it gives us a way to learn to get along that the pressures of work don't allow us to learn. Mm-hmm. So when we're studying together, we are also learning to like each other and learning to interact with each other as humans. Mm-hmm. But we chose a way of studying together that was kind of unusual at the time, but it's where 5 or 6 of us would sit at a single computer, and we would switch out the people that are sitting at the computer itself and the person who's guiding them every 4 minutes. So if you could picture 5 or 6 people sitting in front of a computer, we usually think of that, as programming as a solo endeavor. Here's 5 or 6 people sitting together, and the person at the keyboard is just following the directions or the idea of somebody else. And as we use this as our practice mechanism, we were learning 3 or 4 things. One of them was how to just go ahead and do someone else's idea. Someone shares an idea. You don't argue with them about it. You just merely do it and see what we learn. Another thing we were learning was how to explain ourselves better, how to use the whiteboard to communicate, how to come up with an idea, not only something that works in our own head, but that everybody else can kind of get the feel for. So we have to learn how to do that communication. And we were also learning how to wait our turn to speak, because everybody else on the team, we have, let's say, 5 or 6 people, one's at the keyboard, one's standing up and describing what they want to have done next. Everybody else's job is to wait their turn, listen to what's going on. Well, this little mechanism of training together led us to become good at interacting with each other. Mm-hmm. And after it was almost 5 or 6 months of doing this, one day we had to look at some work that somebody was having trouble with. It's one of the jobs I had postponed. And they came to me and said, hey, we got to get going on this. And I said, what do you want to do about it? And the person said, well, I'd like to look at the code. I'll take another developer with me and we'll come back and tell you what we saw. And in about an hour, they came back. They told me, this code's terrible. We'd like to have everybody look at it, and we'll decide who should be working on it. Well, that was a big step forward for them already, because the code was terrible. But terrible code or not very good code exists because we don't know what good code would look like or what we need to get good code. So that was a step forward. We gathered in a meeting. In a traditional meeting, you look at something, you discuss it, you talk about what we're going to do, you maybe make some decisions, and then assign work to people. So that was the kind of meeting they wanted to hold. But in the middle of that meeting, we started actually working on the code. We've been learning a mechanism of improving bad code without having to read the code. So essentially, it's a way of learning about the code by actually trying to improve it. And after a couple hours of doing that, somebody came into the room and told us you need to leave. We have this room scheduled for another meeting. And somebody on the team jumped up and said, hey, let's just go find another empty room somewhere. So it was their way of saying, let's just keep doing this. And that was in 2011, and we haven't stopped since. But what we discovered after that happened, so this was just a team learning to work well together without the interference of somebody managing them, telling them how to learn to do that or what to do. But after doing that, we realized we had to start learning how to explain what this is, because people started asking us. And this is where we discovered the idea that we've really achieved a type of single piece flow or one piece flow or whatever they call it nowadays.
Right. Yeah. Either term. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there you go. So if we want to talk about flow, you can imagine that with solo working, you're still collaborating with other people. You're just collaborating in the least collaborative way possible by having little meetings and communicating through email, and maybe by checking your code in, which you add your code to the existing code base and other people looking at it. In most businesses, we don't really make it easy for us to collaborate. And in software, that's something, I don't know if by default it was that way, but a lot of firms think you need to just break up the work, give it to individuals, and expect them to just, to somehow do it solo and then gather it together. So,
well, that idea of breaking the work down into little chunks sounds like the really old Frederick Taylor method or the Henry Ford assembly line method. If you just divide the work up into small enough chunks, you can, if you will, just bring anyone in off the street,
right,
plug them in and do it. But, you talked earlier about highly skilled craftspeople, which is what we would consider software developers to be, right?
That's true.
So I put them in that deconstructed, do one part of the job type framework. It doesn't seem like that would be compatible with what they want to do or how they want to work.
Yeah, that's a good point. I believe there's very little thinking that we do alone in any work that we do, but that most people think that we think alone. That's my brain is my brain. Nobody else really has access to that. The only thing I can do is think alone. But in reality, you and I having this conversation is a type of collaboration. But even if I was just sitting writing a blog post or something, I'm thinking in a language that other people invented. I'm using ideas that I've discussed with other people or from things I've read. Almost anything we do is a type of collaboration. But maybe we just don't notice that or admit it, and we end up being very ineffective in our collaboration. I can see this. There's the idea of collective thought. If you get 5 or 6 people together and they start discussing something, you're going to get a different result than if you posed a question to those 5 or 6 people, had them sit apart and write down their ideas. So just a different form of thinking. In fact, I've watched this with the group. I try to observe these things in groups. If you take a group of people, let's say in software, and you put them in front of a whiteboard, you get a whole different conversation than if they don't have the whiteboard. So it's like there's all these little things we can do to enhance the collaboration, and it can be it's worth exploring them with seeing what you can do.
And so when you talk about groups of people, 5 or 6 people working together around a computer, I don't think you've used the term yet, but this is what, did you coin this phrase, mob programming?
Yeah, so that was a phrase that had been around years earlier,
okay.
A paper that was written in 2001 or 2, but I always liked the term, and somewhere in the late 2000 decade, I started doing these gatherings at user groups and little conferences and stuff where we'd get a room full of programmers and work on something together. And I would always make this sort of a joke. This is going to be like pair programming, but with more people. And I say it can turn into a mob, so I call it mob programming, but we don't really want it to be a mob. So there's the idea of an unruly mob. We want to have a ruly mob. So we're going to learn to work together, and we need some simple protocol to do it. So it was a way to jokingly bring us into, there's you've heard these old jokes, like you give a problem to 10 programmers and you're going to get back 11 answers, And so it's like, yeah, everybody's going to have their own idea of how they want to fix this or write this code or whatever it is. So we had some simple rules. One of them was we're going to take turns. If you come up, you can't throw away the work somebody else did. So if you want to change it, you have to change it in smaller steps, baby steps, and so on. So we made a protocol, and I was using that. So it was just a way to joke with programmers about how this worked. But I like the idea of a mob if I describe it this way. A mob is a group of people who have gathered together to accomplish something they couldn't do alone. And it has a negative connotation, and I can see that. I originally wanted to call it whole team programming, because that's a term that's used in Agile software development. But that's so drab, nobody called it that.
Yeah.
And then somebody heard that our team we called ourselves the mob programming team at this company where we originated this. And that just picked up almost immediately. And at the very first conference where I talked about it, before I was really calling it mob programming, people were coming up and asking about mob programming. So they named it for me. But if you think about it, that 5 or 6 people sitting at one computer, that might be very ineffective if we don't have some decent interaction protocols.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to take this sort of an attitude. When you come in the morning, your job is to make sure everybody else does as good as they can do today. That's your job today. You come in and make it easy for everyone else to do the best they can do. And if each team member comes in that way, our collaboration is going to get better and better. And we had already been practicing for 6 months almost, interacting with each other. We'd started pair programming. Pair programming is where two programmers sit at a desk. And in years earlier, I had experimented with programming with a programmer and a tester working together, a programmer and a business expert working together, and also with all three of those, a programmer, a tester, and a business expert. Nowadays, they would call a product owner. All three of us sitting together means none of us has to have the knowledge that the other two have. And we're acting like a three-headed programmer or whatever. You know, it's like all the brains of three people focused on one thing at one time. I think there's a great benefit to that. Now, I have a picture that I like to use when I'm doing talks on this. It is of an operation. There's some doctors around an operating table. And there are, if that's the proper thing to call it, I'm not a medical person.
That's fine, yeah.
And it happened to be, I found this picture because I wanted to talk about what is teamwork. And it's a famous heart operation on a 12-year-old child back in the 1944 or something. And I was looking at it on a flight. I was a flight from the U.S. to Europe. And I was looking at it on my computer. And the guy sitting next to me goes, "Oh, that's the such and such operation. Yeah, I've studied that in school." I said, "Oh, cool. You're a surgeon?" Yeah, he was a surgeon. So I said, "Can I ask you some questions?" So this is like a warning. If you see me getting on the plane and I find out that you do something I'm interested in, I might scrape out of your brain every bit that I can. But I looked at the picture with him, and he pointed out there were 3 surgeons in that picture. Each one had their own specialty. This is about flow, because if they weren't all there, they couldn't have done this operation. So they're going to go from beginning to end without the queuing, without the inventory, without the interruptions. And there were like 5 or 6 technicians, a supervising surgeon of some kind who wasn't actually doing anything. They had all practiced their different parts of this. It was beautiful. So this idea of flow is important when you're doing something like surgery.
Yeah.
And it's the basic same idea.
Well, you're making me think of something that had been developed in healthcare probably 12 years ago. A health system in Wisconsin called ThedaCare developed a model for inpatient care units that they called collaborative care. They could have called it mob care.
Yeah.
Because what they were trying to do was kind of increase the amount of real-time collaboration between doctor, nurse, and pharmacist. The biggest changes was getting pharmacists literally out of the pharmacy and up physically located in units. And that meant reconfiguring the work and the balance of work. And they still had to have somebody in the pharmacy fulfilling medications, but the clinical discussions about medications were happening more real time instead of a handed off message through whatever technology was used for messaging, and getting tighter collaboration between doctors and nurses. So that meant redesigning. I'm certainly not an expert on their system, but I visited and saw how they had physically redesigned the workspace. You didn't have a doctor's workroom and a nurse's room and the pharmacist down in the pharmacy. They designed spaces where all 3 could actually sit. Now they might be on computers doing their charting, but I think it was a really interesting rethinking of the work. And it sounds like you're describing flow as trying to speed up or smooth out handoffs from one person to another. That we don't.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
So part of that is eliminating the need for the handoffs.
Okay. Yeah.
So somebody at one of my workshops I did was listening very well to what I was saying, and they contributed this. They say you're not trying to run the race faster, you're trying to shorten the race.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's in a way where if we work separately, then the communication lag extends quickly. So if I need to communicate with you, Mark, and you're sitting right next to me, then we will already be close to being in the same context. Now, with mob programming or with group programming, we would be in the same context. We're looking at the same computer screens, working on the same thing. So that gives us a really quick feedback. But if we're working side by side, I can turn to you at any moment and just ask you a question. Whereas if you are 5 cubicles down, I have to either get up and walk over there, and then I feel like, oh, I'm interrupting him. Maybe I'll just send a message first. And so each separation of the other people on the team, we are increasing the lag time or the queuing. Now, if I send you an email saying, hey, I got to talk to you about this thing, you look at it and you go, well, I got to finish what I'm doing by the end of the day. So you send back an email saying, can we meet first thing tomorrow morning? Well, we've just introduced a very laggy system where we have a big queue involved. The queuing is a big problem in lean manufacturing, but the queuing is also a big problem in product development. Reinertson's book, he makes the claim that queuing is the cause of the majority of waste in product development, and software development is product development.
Yeah.
But I would say, regardless of what your field is, queuing is going to be a waste. But if it's the majority of the waste, or at least the largest portion, I guess, majority of the waste, then what's our benefit of reducing that? What are we going to get back if we reduce that? And essentially what we're trying to do is have this manageable cycle time. We aren't necessarily working any more or less when we remove that cycle time or remove that queuing, but we are going to see things being accomplished much sooner. It's the idea. It's not that we're working faster or harder. It's just that we removed waste. It's a simple concept. It's kind of hard to understand. I mean, you do such a good job. I heard you or saw you once where maybe it was in a tweet or something where you said, let's not say let's cut costs. Let's make it easy for people to do their work, and lower costs are going to be a benefit of that. If we've gotten to the point where demanding lower costs right now, cutting costs right now, it may be too late anyways. Let's invest in making it easier for people to work early on, and we will reap those benefits of lowered costs throughout our entire process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, even the idea of paired programming, yet alone a larger group or mob, I could see where the Dilbert pointy hair boss would look and say, well, that's incredibly inefficient. I can improve your efficiency by 50% and fire half of the pairs.
Right.
I mean, how do you, and I think there's this general issue or challenge with lean in different settings, the conflict between quote unquote efficiency and flow. I think if you go back to the Toyota production system, it said the 2 pillars are basically just-in-time flow and quality at the source. They're not really overemphasizing efficiency in terms of just an outputs divided by inputs ratio. You can have a highly efficient system that delivers really slowly. And that's to a competitive disadvantage. Oh yeah.
And there's other problems with this as well. You can be extremely efficient at producing something that will later to be found you can't even sell the thing.
Right.
So the thing about inventory in this scenario is that if we have stacks and stacks of inventory to keep the assembly line operating smoothly, we really have sabotaged ourselves. If you reduce that inventory down to the point where there's, they call it just in time or whatever, but if you reduce that inventory to that degree and can do it well, ideally, the parts that you're going to assemble were manufactured immediately before you assembled them. Well, that ideal can never be really had. But if you want to reduce it, because if you don't, you're going to end up with things like producing lots of stuff nobody wants, but also you might have produced just imagine this like a typical scenario. You've made a part, it's got holes drilled in it, and you're going to fit other pieces into the holes. And then when you get the other pieces to put in, they're not fitting. But we got 1 million of these things drilled and 1 million of those parts made. There's a huge waste here that we would have discovered. So we attempt to solve that by doing continuous inspections and stuff, which are just another kind of waste.
Right.
And so, but if we discover it as soon as the two parts are ready to assemble, then we can stop assembly, pull the cord or whatever they say, stop the line. This is the same basic thing in this knowledge work area of software development. We can discover a really blatant example that I saw once was we were sitting with the team, and one of the team members is an expert on the database we're using. And a front-end person was discussing some feature we're going to have and some information that's going to be displayed to the user. And the database person could say, well, where are we going to get that information? So that is coming forward in real time so that everybody's thinking about this stuff rather than having meetings later or beforehand to discuss it. One of the biggest problems with having meetings is, the famous saying, we think we've communicated when we actually haven't. And really, this is mob programming or group programming like this in a way, just like I think the example you gave with the pharmacist and the nursing staff and the doctors all working much closer together. Basically, what's going to happen is we're going to find out sooner rather than later. And this allows us to apply everybody's brain at the same time to what solutions might we want to try. If I believe things have to be a certain way, and I don't realize how difficult that makes your job until later, after we've had many meetings and so on, we've introduced waste into our system. But if you're there to share your concerns at the same moment they first come up, we get to operate on it much, much sooner. And so the benefit that I saw after a year or two of working in this way, where everybody's sitting at the same computer, was things were getting done a lot quicker. The work itself was going from start to finish very rapidly. Right. Their quality was becoming very high. The knowledge that we were gaining as a team was growing rapidly, which wasn't growing before, and it was a stress-free environment. In other words, we were no longer concerned about a lot of things that would have driven the stress up on the team. We become very territorial. When people come and demand from us the work that we need to do, we become less territorial when we're sharing the decisions with those other people. Yeah. I think the stress and the things like territorialism and so on don't help. We need to get rid of those things.
Can I tell you a quick story, a different story from healthcare that comes to mind? Because you might appreciate this when it comes to territory or silos. And like one thing I've learned or I've seen is when people work in different departments or co-located, it's really easy and tempting to blame those faceless jerks in that other department.
Yes.
And so the dynamic I was seeing was the emergency room nurses would draw blood specimens, and they would have the tube, and they would print out a label, and they would label it, and they would send it to the lab. And from the ER's perspective, boy, that lab, they're always complaining that the labels are on crooked. And you know how lab people are. They're just overly particular and anal retentive and too detailed, and that's why they work in the lab, and kind of invalidating the complaints about the labels being crooked. Well, from the lab's perspective, they were thinking, those people in the ER, I mean, maybe they're in a rush, but they're careless and they never label those tubes properly. And then we have to relabel them, which is, hugely wasteful on our part. And why can't they just put the labels on straight? So one of the things we facilitated was literally forming a team, getting people from the nurses to come visit the lab and vice versa, to understand their environments. And the biggest takeaway was for the ER nurses to understand how the laboratory equipment worked. And if you can imagine a tube of blood standing up vertically and going down this conveyor belt, and there are barcode scanners, and apparently, the orientation of the barcode really did make a difference on whether the scanner would get it or not. And once the nurses saw that and they realized there really was more of a necessary reason for that label to be straight, it wasn't just the whim or the preference of those people in the lab who were easily discounted. Like just bringing together people to see that and talk through it. It wasn't a permanent co-location of the teams, but it was really more a matter of just breaking down the silos and, for one, getting them to meet each other as people. Back to what you said about people learning how to relate to each other, and literally like knowing who those people are and that they have names, and then understanding how their work fit into the context. That label problem pretty much took care of itself overnight. So again, it's not that the people in the ED couldn't label them straight. They didn't really fully grasp why it was necessary. And it wasn't complicated, but in these departments were literally 100 feet down the hall from each other, but yet there was this huge disconnect.
Well, that's a great example. Actually, if that's been documented somewhere, I'd love to read about that. But you know the famous King's Cross fire in the London Underground. What they basically found was that the territorialism between departments made a disastrous fire become a small fire become a disastrous fire, because you weren't allowed to report an incident through the correct channels unless it got to a certain level of that's right, where emergency.
Severity.
And so this was just a little part of it. There was the fire department, the maintenance crews, and on had all become very compartmentalized. And so if a problem did start occurring, which it did, I don't remember how many people, but a number of people died in that. It was back in the 80s, I guess. But this basic idea that we can't understand, why are they so pressuring us so much to do things this way? What I like to encourage teams to do is that once we've identified that we have things that are, and I ask the question this way: what happens, or what things are occurring that make it difficult for you to do your work effectively? And if I ask that question in a workshop, I'll usually get from 20 people, we'll get maybe 50 answers in 5 minutes. So we gather those together, group them, look at them, and essentially all of those things usually are symptoms. They're not actual problems. Why? So like one thing programmers will often say is, I have to go to too many meetings. Well, the meetings themselves aren't the problem. The meetings exist because of some need that's not being fulfilled. And so the meetings themselves are a symptom of a problem. And we need to understand the problem rather than trying to deal with the symptoms.
Yeah.
If we deal with the symptoms, we will more likely hide the problem than solve the problem. And now we have two problems. The original problem is now hidden, and the original problem still exists. But I believe there's a bigger problem here as well. I'll use that term. Mm-hmm. I don't think most problems can be solved of the types that we're going to get that really can make a difference. If we know the Cynefin framework, if your listeners don't know it, we can put a link to that maybe in. But with the Cynefin framework, there's these different domains. And one is the clear domain. One is complicated, one's called complex, and one's called chaotic. In the clear domain, yeah, we can solve problems. My computer shuts down early because the battery is getting old. We can identify it easily, and then we know the solution. Put in a new battery. And then that one will last for 2 or 3 years, and that's the clear space. But in the complex space, where much of our work exists, you can't just see the problem and say, I know the solution. Usually it's a wicked problem, which is one that you can't even begin to understand the problem till you've tried a few solutions. And you're going to discover real quickly that we're usually dealing with the symptom instead of the problem. And one thing I like to share about that is that if we are working on symptoms instead of problems, then we need to, I would say, reframe what we think the problem is. We probably need to get different perspectives. We need other people to come in and look at it with us. So a lot of the collaboration that works in this software development is, that I think can work in many other domains, is that we are inviting all the different perspectives on things that are happening. I've watched this for years. I'm going to be really bold about it right now. I think that the big problem management usually introduces is that famous quote from Peter Drucker, that much of what we consider management is simply making it hard for people to work. And I think I know the reason for it. I could be wrong. But managers see one of the problems they need to solve is that we need to make it easy. Management's hard to do. We need to make it easier to manage things. That's a mistake. We shouldn't make it easier to manage things. Let's make it easier for people to get their work done. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes easy to manage. Yeah. It's the same thing that I shared from you earlier about cutting costs.
Right.
Yeah. It's a difficult thing. Why are things so hard to manage? Because we think we need to manage them. Mm. There's a lot going on here. We can't cover in this short amount of time.
Yeah. But, thought-provoking though. But again, like a lot of it comes back to systems. I hear many complaints in healthcare about similar idea of management making it harder to do the work, or management not helping make it any easier.
Right.
Similar dynamic maybe, and back in manufacturing, I remember there was always people who preferred to work second shift because there weren't as many managers around.
Right.
Just leave me alone and let me do my work. If your presence isn't going to be helping me, at least I can avoid being irritated by it. And it's sad to hear that in healthcare sometimes.
So this is related to the symptoms versus the problems themselves. Right. So if somebody is going to, if they feel safe enough to even say that to someone, that I prefer the second shift. When I was a kid doing odd jobs, so to speak, I got a job at a fast food place. And I went on the midnight shift, which would go from about 11 until 7 a.m. And mostly what you did on that shift is clean the stainless steel everywhere. But also there's no managers there. So, you're kind of in your own space doing a mindless work. And that's not necessarily unpleasant. So, I can see how that can be. Many people in software want to just be in the space of the code. And they learn all kinds of ways to avoid interacting with other people, going to meetings, and so on. And yet, I went to one place not too long ago. Whenever I hear a word, when I'm consulting with someone or helping them work through something, when I hear a word repeated 2 or 3 times, I write it down on my little notebook and start putting check marks next to it.
Yeah.
If I hear something like 5 or 10 times, I'm going to go, that's a word that we better look at. And I just heard the word meetings over and over again. And I finally started gathering numbers from the developers. They were in meetings on average 6 hours a day. So, you're not programmers, you're meeting goer tours or something like that. You're not, you can't program if you're mostly in meetings. So, whatever we do, symptoms, meetings are a symptom, I think, of we haven't found a way to communicate important things in a more direct manner. And we end up, there's many practices in business that we do because we haven't recognized that there might be some better way to do it. And the 2 big ones are, maybe we need a more direct way of communicating, or maybe we don't need to be communicating these things. It's not just make it easier to communicate. It may be, let's eliminate the need to communicate it.
Well, it makes me think of a phrase. It could be attributed to many people. Perhaps, let's not do the wrong thing righter.
Yes.
Well,
I read a book recently about how to make your meetings better, something like that. And as I read the book, I really wanted to see what's the point of view. I just kept telling myself, the first step is get rid of most of your meetings. Yeah. Let's not try to make the meetings more engaging or fun or whatever.
Here, my observation from different settings is when there's some sort of regular meeting that gets referred to by its time of day.
Oh, yeah.
It's probably not a very useful meeting. Are you going to the 10 o'clock?
Yeah.
We're just filling time? What's going on here?
Well, that's a really good point, because we can observe our workplace and get a feel for where the problems might be just by seeing how the culture has absorbed that practice into it. I do believe a lot of what's difficult in the workplace is the culture in place. So whatever culture is there is going to reveal to a good observer, what the problems are. I don't think it's easy for us to change the culture. I don't believe that can be transformed, or whatever people like to say. We're doing a culture transformation. I'm not sure that's possible, but we certainly can create opportunities for other good things to be happening around us. And that's one of the things we really paid a lot of attention to. When we originated the idea of mob programming, we were also using this mechanism that I call turn up the good. And I had seen this throughout my life, but I heard various people talking about them. This one of them, Kent Beck, who was also at the conference we were at, he originated this idea. But basically, he had practices in software development that he understood were useful. What happens if we just start turning those up like a sound mixing board? Just turn things up. And then let's see how high can we turn each thing up. And I believe that's a really good approach. It lessens the need to solve problems, because as you turn up the good on the things that are working well, a lot of problems just disappear or fade away, or at least minimize to the point where you don't see them as problems anymore. If you get really good at working with your coworkers, a lot of the problems of the workplace disappear. How can we, let's just turn up the good on collaboration. That's one of the things we were trying to do. I think that actually is a part of what the original lean thinkers were doing, was finding ways to take advantage of what was working for them. I'm sure they focused a lot on solving problems, but I want to emphasize again those Cynefin domains. In some domains, it's really easy to identify the problems, follow some basic best practice kind of stuff, and you've got it solved. But when you moved into the complicated and then complex space, which is complex spaces where I operate, you cannot just simply identify a problem and solve it. It takes a great deal of experimenting and discovery, as opposed to analysis. And you need to try things and see where it takes you.
So maybe one other topic that I wanted to touch on a little bit, this maybe in this realm of eliminating something instead of getting better at doing it.
Yes.
The no estimates movement. I can only imagine. Because in healthcare, let's say operating rooms, they schedule procedures, and it's not like in most procedures there's going to be variation, and it's not like an assembly line with a very predictable 45-second job cycle. The last thing a surgeon would want is some manager being overbearing about the estimate for how long that procedure is going to take, especially if it's a really relatively new, innovative procedure. How long is that going to take? Why aren't you done yet? How much longer is that going to take? They get thrown out of the operating room because of the maybe the power dynamics. But maybe can you talk about am I exaggerating the way software estimates are either irritating or dysfunctional? What leads to the no estimates movement?
So this, I think, is very much related with what we've already been talking about. So first of all, I observed, working at a company in 1999, I observed a cycle of we would do work, then we would reflect on how it went, and then we would determine how to improve things, and then we'd go off and do work again. They were using a 6-week cycle. So we would have, they basically had a couple weeks for developing the requirements and estimating the work, then a couple weeks to actually do the coding, and then a couple weeks to integrate the coding with the rest of the application and do the testing. So this was going to be their 6-week iteration, which is a very long iteration span for nowadays programming. But in those days, that was still at the beginnings of these things. So at the end of the first iteration, we did our reflection on how things had gone. It came out, one of the things that they found was the estimates weren't very useful. So what they decided to do was, let's get better at doing our estimates. This is mostly young people. I was already in my mid-40s, but most of the developers were in their early 20s, like 21 to 23. And so they decided there was about 200 developers. We need to get better at doing our estimates. So we got some trainers to come in and teach us about what you needed to know. And part of that is you need to have your requirements rather well defined. And that was another problem they had. The requirements weren't really well specified. And another problem they were having was things kept changing during the iteration. So how are you going to solve these things? Well, we need better estimates based on better defined things, and no changes are allowed during an iteration. But at the end of that 6 weeks, the second 6 weeks, those three problems still existed. We've been trained to do better estimates. We've been trained to get better requirements, but the training didn't help us that much. We still had the same problems. So they decided to, again, let's get even better. Let's work to get better at our estimates. After three of these cycles, I stood up in the meeting. I was avoiding talking because I knew that they would can me if I said anything, So that, but finally I stood up and said, I think we have a situation here where we're looking at the symptoms instead of the problems, just like what we were talking about a few minutes ago. And I explained what was going on, what I thought was going on. And then the next day, nobody would talk to me. And for about 5 or 6 days, nobody in the organization would talk to me. I was doing my work and I'd go to talk to someone and they'd interact with me. But if I'm walking down the hallway and a group of people are coming up in the other direction and say, "Hey, Jim, how you doing?" They just walked past me. I finally cornered one of these young people and I said, "What's going on here?" And they were too taken aback by me asking them to run away from me. And he said, "Well, the managers told us not to talk to you." And I thought, okay, that's not the problem I thought we were having. But this, I identified it and started calling it the cycle of continuous no improvements. We have this cycle of no improvements because we just don't want to believe that the processes we're following aren't working for us. And we attempt to solve the same problems over and over again. And then we're either hiding the problems by dealing with the symptoms, or we're introducing new problems in some other way. That was where it became clear to me that I would like to be talking to people about estimates, because I had experienced an earlier contract where they didn't do estimates. The main problem with estimates in software development is we are doing product development, and there's very little of what you're doing that's going to be highly repetitive. And you could say, well, we need to add a new table to the database, or we need to add we need a new screen, and we can think that that's just repetitive work. It's a new page on your website. How much long does it take to do a page? You just do it. But estimates in the software industry for years, they've had this thing called, I think it's the Standish report. I'd have to look it up. But basically, how well did projects do against their estimates? And high level of failure over many years. But they're using the wrong thing, in my opinion, to judge success. Because if we were to get a project done on time and on budget, is that a measurement of success? Well, I would say a much better measurement of success might be, did we deliver something the customer wanted? Is this thing being used by people? Are they happy with its use, and do they want more features? There's other things to measure, because if we just get things done on time and on budget, that's not a good measurement of a success. Then we're focusing on the wrong thing. That becomes, is it Deming who says, or maybe it was Russell Acuff who said, essentially, if you give a manager a numeric goal to meet, they will essentially ruin the company to meet that goal.
Yeah, that's a Deming point. And
a Deming thing, okay. And I love Deming. Yeah. And so this was the beginning of me thinking I need to talk about it in software development. But almost 10 years earlier, I'd experienced working without estimates in custom manufacturing. I owned a small company, and some of my customers we would manufacture certain things for. And one day, somebody came into me with an emergency, and that emergency was for a new customer I never dealt with before. And as I looked at the problem, they had an emergency that had an extremely strict, very short deadline for doing some work on some prototypes that they needed to take to a trade show in just a couple of weeks. A big manufacturing firm, well known in the computer industry. And so as I looked at their thing, I said, we can't know whether we can do this yet. So what I'm going to require, if you want us to do it, is you have to provide somebody to be on my site to snap decisions throughout this process. In 3 days, they wanted us to accomplish something. And I'd asked them, why did you come to us? And they said, we've run out of people to go to. all of their usual vendors and everybody else that they had tried, nobody would tackle it. It was a Friday afternoon they came to me. But I saw that as an opportunity. So we dug into it. We actually accomplished what they needed, but we couldn't have done it if they didn't have a person in my shop prepared to make decisions immediately. Like, I can accomplish this. Is that good enough? Yes, good enough. Okay, we move forward. Not good enough, then let's try something else. They made those snap decisions. We accomplished the work. And this is the basic idea of the no estimates, is that if we work together, we can get a better result. Matter of fact, I can make this guarantee right now. If I had to estimate that for them, it would have taken me a few weeks to estimate the work. I would have had to do some prototypes, and so they would have missed their deadline if I had to do the estimates.
Yeah.
So this was the beginning of my thinking about, I think I'd rather work with customers who don't need estimates than work with customers who require the estimates. And I lost a lot of work over the years to people who bid less than me on work. And as I analyzed it, as a matter of fact, at one point in our company, my wife and I would sort of do a mini celebration whenever we would lose a job because of price. Because we would kind of say, good, someone else is losing money instead of us, right? And so, because we knew what it took to make money off this stuff. Yeah. So anyway, so the thing in software development is that estimates are thought to be necessary to be able to make decisions. But I learned this many years ago. There are better ways to make the decisions we need. And the further you are from when something needs to be completed, the more necessary it is to have some kind of estimates to be able to make your decisions. I believe if we just break things down as we go into small things, and we don't need to estimate to do that. It's kind of like if you take a piece of paper, boy, I don't know if I can show you. So here's a ripped up piece of paper. And if I do this to it, I now have two smaller bits, and I did not need to estimate anything. And this is smaller than those bits, and this is smaller than those bits. I can take things apart without ever making an estimate.
Yeah.
But when I get something to a point where I can easily work on it, that's where I like to get it. But I don't need to rip the rest of this up to do that. All I need to do is get one part that we think has some value and start working on it. Well, that's unique to software development, perhaps, but that's the thing with software development. If our estimates are not helping us and we can't get good enough, I've been working in software in some form or another for almost 40 years. I don't think I've seen a period where people weren't talking about we need to get better at our estimates. If you can't get better at estimates in 40 years, let's try something else. And I do believe that estimates are a symptom of a decision-making process that doesn't work very well. How do we find that better decision-making process? And I believe that the modern thinking about agile concepts, partly what they call Kanban, but the idea of working on limiting your work in progress or your work in process, limiting that, learning as you go, discovering what your customers really want becomes possible. What I find is that if we start delivering something that we think is valuable, we will learn quickly about what we want next, and we will get better and better at making those decisions without ever needing to have estimates. But it's almost impossible for most organizations to make that leap. It's a very difficult point to see. And I can offer no guidance on how you can convince somebody else that this is worth considering.
Yeah.
What I do find is there are a lot of people who are ready to consider these things, and those are the people I prefer to work with. If you're ready to try something new, you've already been burnt enough with the old thinking. Yeah, let's try some new things.
And for those people who want to find you, you've got your website, woodyzuill.com, Zuill.
That's probably the best thing right there. I do tweet a lot, or sometimes I tweet a lot, sometimes I don't. But and I like the Twitter environment. I'm Woody Zuill in Twitter. And I'm easy to find in LinkedIn. I will always accept an invitation in LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And I'm very boldly, if you want to talk with me, I'm always open to talking, just like this one-on-one with anybody.
Yeah. If
there's something you think I can contribute.
Well, I know there is. And final question I'm going to ask you, because it says on the website here, your name, mob programming, teamwork, good stuff, and whatnot. So
Yeah,
final
that's
question. Do you have a favorite whatnot these days?
well, I really enjoy, lately I've been enjoying working with teams that are newly remote. And so this is one of the things that I've been enjoying quite a bit. I love to work with people who are trying to learn to collaborate well.
Mm-hmm.
So mob programming is very specific to software development. But these ideas, I'm working with a team that does engineering. And this is the stuff I love.
Well, thank you for taking some time to talk about that. I always love talking to people who talk about something they love. I guess that's really what the podcast is about here. So again, our guest today has been Woody Zuill. Woody, it's been really nice being able to interact with you in that group, consultant Zoom call, and appreciate, you have a lot of helpful, thought-provoking things to share. So I'm glad we could do that today one-on-one and share that with others here through the podcast.
It's been my honor.
Yeah, thank you.
My honor. Thank you.